What is God testing you in? Have you ever wondered what God is testing you in? Or have you simply assumed that everything happening right now is just life being too harsh on you? Have you ever felt that you've tried so hard, prayed so much, yet God still hasn't answered, and somehow things only seem to get harder? Maybe you're not here by accident. Maybe this moment isn't just coincidence. Maybe right now you are in a season where everything feels heavier than usual. Not completely falling apart, but no longer as light as it once was. A season where you begin to ask, why me? Why is this happening right now? You keep living. You still wake up every day. You still do what needs to be done. You still hold everything together, at least on the outside. But inside, something is slowly wearing down. Not a sharp pain, but a quiet exhaustion. A feeling like you're holding yourself together without even knowing why anymore. There are moments when you look at yourself and don't quite recognize who you are. You used to be stronger, clearer, more certain, but now you're slowing down. Not because you want to, but because you no longer have the strength to keep running the way you used to. And in that slowing down, the questions begin to surface. What is God doing in my life? Is this a test, or am I just failing? Is God trying to teach me something, or am I simply lost? You don't have immediate answers, and maybe that's the hardest part. Not the struggle itself, but not understanding its meaning. Because if you knew this was a test with purpose, maybe you could endure it more easily. But when everything feels unclear, doubt begins to grow. You question your circumstances, you question your decisions, and sometimes you even question God. You don't say it out loud. You stay quiet. You keep praying. You keep trying to believe. But deep inside, there's a space, an emptiness you don't know how to fill. Maybe you're tired, not just from work, but from life itself. Tired of holding everything together. Tired of pretending you're okay when you're not. Tired of continuing when you're not even sure you're heading in the right direction. Some days, you wake up, and the first thing you feel isn't hope, but pressure. Pressure to keep going. Pressure to try harder. Pressure not to fall apart, even when part of you just wants to stop. You have prayed many times, maybe in your weakest moments, maybe when you had no one else to talk to. You spoke to God, honestly, openly. You asked for a way out, a sign, an answer. But then, nothing clear happened. No doors suddenly opened. No miracle appeared. Nothing strong enough to make you certain that everything would be okay. And slowly, it starts to feel like your prayers are disappearing into the void. You still pray, but not like before. Not with the same urgency. Not with the same expectation. You speak, but you don't know if anyone is listening. You believe, but your faith doesn't feel as solid as it once did. And sometimes, you ask yourself, am I being tested? But right after that, another question rises. Or, has God gone silent on me? You don't want to think that way. You don't want to doubt. But the feeling is still there. Quiet, subtle, yet strong enough to make you hesitate. You start seeing everything differently. Challenges are no longer just challenges. They feel like burdens. Obstacles are no longer tests. They feel like signs of failure. And you begin to wonder if you've taken the wrong path. You look at others. You see them moving forward, seemingly clearer, more successful, more at peace. And you begin to compare, not out of jealousy, but out of confusion. Why am I stuck here? But what you don't see is that many of them feel the same way you do. They just don't say it out loud. Maybe what you're going through isn't a sign that you're on the wrong path. Maybe it's a sign that you're going deeper. But when you don't understand that, everything just feels heavy. You keep trying, but inside, a part of you wants to let go, not of life, but of the need to understand everything, the need to have answers right away. But then, fear shows up. Fear that if you let go, things will fall apart. Fear that if you stop controlling, you'll lose direction completely. Fear that if you pause, you may never stand back up. So you keep going, uncertain, unclear, but still moving forward. Maybe you don't realize it, but this season is bringing you face to face with something very real. Not just external struggles, but something deeper within you being touched. Not to break you, but perhaps to transform you. But when you can't see that yet, everything just feels like exhaustion. And maybe, if you're hearing this right now, you don't need an answer immediately. You just need to know, your feelings are real, your exhaustion is real, your confusion is real, and maybe you are not alone in this. There's something you may have felt, but never fully named. It's the silence, not the silence of people around you, but the silence of God. A very particular kind of silence, not loud, yet deep enough to shake you. You still pray, you still talk to God, you still ask questions, but on the other side, there's no clear response, no definite sign, nothing that allows you to say, "Yes, I heard him," and that is what makes you wonder, is God really silent? Maybe you once believed that if God loves you, he would answer right away. If he cares, he wouldn't let you wait this long. If he is near, you would feel it. But now, in this stillness, you're no longer sure. It feels like you're speaking, but no one replies. Like you're standing at a door, knocking again and again, but no one opens. And that feeling isn't sudden pain, but a lingering emptiness. A quiet uncertainty, leaving you with nothing solid to hold on to. Sometimes, you ask yourself, did I do something wrong? Am I not good enough for God to answer me? Have I gone off track, so he's gone silent? You turn inward, questioning yourself, not to understand, but to find a reason to explain the silence. But the more you search, the more exhausted you become, because no answer feels clear enough. And then, another thought appears, soft but deep. What if God has stopped speaking to me? You don't want to believe that. You push it away, but it returns in your weakest moments, when you're alone, when you have nothing left to hold on to. But pause for a moment, not to find an answer yet, but to look at this silence differently. What if this silence is not absence? What if God hasn't left, but is present in a way you're not used to? We often think presence must come with sound, with words, with clear signals. But some forms of presence, the deeper they are, the quieter they become. Like sitting next to someone you deeply trust, sometimes no words are needed. Yet you know they're there. Maybe God's silence is like that, not emptiness, but a very subtle, very deep presence, so quiet you might miss it. But the challenge is, you're not used to it. You're used to clarity, to answers, to signs you can recognize. You're used to believing that if nothing happens, then nothing exists. And when God doesn't speak the way you expect, you call it silence. But maybe God isn't silent. Maybe the way you are listening doesn't match the way he is speaking. You pray, but your heart is filled with anxiety. You wait for answers, but expect them in a specific form. You look for signs, but only accept the ones you understand. And when none appear, you assume nothing is happening. But maybe, in those moments when you think nothing is happening, something deeper is unfolding. Not outside, but within you. Some changes don't come through clear answers. They come through small, slow, almost invisible shifts that you don't notice right away. And silence creates the space for those shifts to happen. If everything were obvious, you wouldn't pause. If every question had an immediate answer, you wouldn't look deeper. But when nothing is certain, you are forced to face yourself, to see what you've been avoiding. And that is not easy. There are parts of you you don't want to see, fears, wounds, incomplete places. And when God is silent, maybe it's not to abandon you, but to give you space to face those things. Not to break you, but to help you understand yourself. But when you're not ready, that silence feels frightening. You feel left behind, like no one is guiding you, like you're walking alone, in a place where you cannot see ahead. And there, you begin to feel out of control. You don't know what comes next. You don't know if you're right or wrong. You don't know if any of this has meaning. And in that uncertainty, anxiety grows. But look again. If God had truly left you, would you still be searching? If he were truly gone, would you still be asking these questions? The fact that you are still seeking, still asking, still longing is already a sign. A quiet, but very real sign that something within you is still reaching toward God. And maybe that is how He is speaking to you. Not through words, not through sound, but through that longing itself. You cannot force yourself to long if nothing inside you moves. You cannot pretend to search if there is no real need. And that need may be the sign of His presence. Quiet, unclear, but real. Maybe you thought to understand God, you needed clarity. Answers, a powerful moment. But maybe to truly understand, you need the opposite. You need to slow down, to become still, to release the need to control everything. Not to give up, but to open to a different way of listening. One that doesn't depend on sound, but on stillness. One that doesn't require immediate understanding, but allows things to unfold. And maybe, in that process, you begin to realize the silence you feared is not abandonment. It is a space where you are being led in a very different way. Not through clarity, but through trust. Not through seeing everything, but through continuing, even when you see nothing. And maybe that is the real test. Not a test of circumstances. Not a test of ability, but a test of faith. Can you keep going without immediate answers? Can you trust when everything is still unclear? Can you move forward without knowing exactly where you're going? Maybe that is what God is testing you in. Not to make you fall, but to see if you are ready to step into a deeper kind of faith. A faith not built on feelings, not built on clear signs, but built on something very quiet, yet very real, that even when you hear nothing, you are not alone. There are times when you don't need another explanation. You just need a story real enough for you to see yourself in it. Not something grand or extraordinary, but something very human, very close, just like your own life. There was a man in his early 30s. He had a stable job, a life that, from the outside, looked perfectly fine. Every day, he woke up on time, went to work, fulfilled his responsibilities, came home, had dinner, and then repeated the same cycle. He wasn't particularly happy, but he wasn't unhappy either. Everything just moved along steadily. Until one day, everything changed. The company he worked for suddenly restructured. There was no warning, no time to prepare. He was laid off in just one short meeting. Everything he thought was stable disappeared. He walked out with a strange feeling, not immediate panic, but a kind of emptiness. In the days that followed, he began to feel it more clearly. Pressure, anxiety, uncertainty, questions kept coming. What am I going to do next? Where did I go wrong? Why now? He started to pray, not the calm kind of prayer, but anxious, desperate ones. He asked God to open a new door, for an opportunity, for a sign. He sent out dozens of applications, waited, hoped, but then, day after day, there was no response, no calls, no sign that anything would change. And slowly, he began to feel that God was silent. He kept praying, but inside, something began to shift. The urgency faded. His faith became more fragile. He didn't say it out loud, but deep down, he started to doubt. Not whether God existed, but whether God was actually listening. There were nights when he sat alone, doing nothing, just staring into space, feeling like he was falling into a place with no ground beneath him. No plan, no direction, nothing certain. Then one day, after weeks of no results, he stopped. Not because he gave up, but because he was exhausted. He didn't have the energy to keep chasing uncertainty anymore. He began spending more time at home. At first, it felt uncomfortable, like he was falling behind. But then, in that slowing down, something very small began to change. He started to realize it had been a long time since he was truly present in his own life. Before, he was always busy, always chasing work, always thinking about the future. But now, for the first time, he had time to sit and do nothing. He began talking more with his wife, playing more with his child, listening to small things he used to ignore. And in those very ordinary moments, he started to feel something different. Not a big joy, but a gentle quietness. One evening, when everything was still, he sat there, not asking for anything, not questioning anything, just sitting and breathing. And in that moment, something appeared. Not a voice, not a clear answer, but a very soft realization. Maybe I haven't truly been listening for a long time. He wasn't sure if that was an answer from God, but it was enough to make him pause and look inward. He realized, before, he always prayed in his own way, always wanted answers in his own timing, but he had never truly been still to listen. A few weeks later, he found a new job. Not perfect, not much better, but enough to begin again. Yet the important thing wasn't the job. It was, he had changed. He was no longer rushing like before, no longer trying to control everything. And he began to understand, maybe the time he thought God was silent was actually when God was working most deeply within him. Another story of a woman, nearly 40. She had gone through a broken marriage, not because she didn't try, not because she didn't love, but some things simply couldn't be held together. In the end, she walked away with a wounded heart. In the beginning, she felt relieved, as if a burden had been lifted. But then, loneliness began to appear, not the kind you see on the outside, but an emptiness within, a space she didn't know how to fill. She began to pray more, not to ask for anything specific, but just to find a sense of safety, a feeling that she was still being held. But like the man, she didn't receive anything clear, no immediate comfort, no feeling of being caught. And she started to think, maybe God was silent with her too. There were days when she felt very weak. She asked herself, what did I do wrong? Why did it end like this? She wanted an answer, something clear, to help her understand. But nothing came, only silence, stretching on. Then one morning, an ordinary one, nothing special, she sat alone, drinking coffee, looking out the window. And in that moment, something shifted. Not her circumstances, not her memories, but the way she felt. For the first time, in a long time, she didn't feel as heavy as before. The pain was still there, but it no longer suffocated her. It was lighter, softer, as if something inside her had been touched very deeply without her realizing it. And she began to understand, maybe God wasn't silent. Maybe he had been there all along, not to remove the pain immediately, but to walk through it with her, little by little. Not with loud words, but with a very gentle, very patient presence. She didn't have answers for everything. She didn't fully understand why it happened, but she no longer felt alone. And that was enough for her to keep going. Maybe these stories are not extraordinary. No big miracles, no sudden transformations. But that's exactly why they are real. And maybe they are more like you than you think. Maybe you are in a place like them, not where everything has completely fallen apart, but where you begin to feel lost. Where you begin to feel you no longer have control like before. But if you look closely, maybe within that very journey, things are changing. Very slowly, very gently, so gently that you don't notice right away. And maybe what you call a test is not meant to hurt you, but to lead you deeper. Not outward, but inward. There is something you may not want to hear, not because it's wrong, but because it touches something very real inside you. A place you usually avoid looking at. Maybe what you are calling a test is not only coming from your circumstances, but from the way you are living, thinking, and holding on to things. Maybe God is not making things harder. Maybe He is revealing what you have been trying to hide for too long. You may be used to controlling your work, your plans, the way things unfold. And when everything goes as expected, you feel safe. You think you're on the right path. But when things begin to shift, when you can no longer control them, you call it a test. But maybe the test is not in the change itself. It's in the fact that you can no longer hold on the way you used to. Maybe God is testing you, not by taking something away, but by asking you a very deep question. Can you let go? Letting go is not quitting, not giving up. It is releasing the need to control everything, releasing the need to understand everything immediately, releasing the need to have clear answers before you take the next step. But that is not easy, because deep inside, you are afraid. Afraid that if you let go, everything will fall apart. Afraid that if you don't hold on, you will lose everything. Afraid that if you don't understand, you will go the wrong way. And that fear makes you hold tighter. The harder it gets, the more you try to control. The more uncertain it is, the more you crave certainty. But the more you try, the more exhausted you become, until eventually, you feel like you are being stretched between holding on and letting go. Maybe that is the real test, not outside circumstances, but the tension within you. Maybe God is not testing how strong you are, but whether you are willing to be a little weak, willing to admit you are not in control, willing to accept you don't understand everything. Because only when you stop and admit that, do you begin to open. And there is something deeper, something even more real, that you may not have seen clearly. Sometimes, you are not only afraid of losing control, you are afraid of change. You are used to your old way of living, your old way of thinking, your familiar patterns, and even if they no longer fit, you hold on. Because they are familiar, they feel safe, they are predictable. But when the test comes, those familiar things begin to shake. You can't continue the same way. You are forced to change. But change always comes with uncertainty. And you begin to resist. You pray, but you only want things to go back to how they were. You ask God for help, but in the way you are used to. You want a new path, but still within the old framework. And when that doesn't happen, you feel confused. Maybe God is not testing you by making life harder. Maybe He is inviting you to step out of an old version of yourself. But to step out, you have to let go. Let go of how you think things should be. Let go of the image you built about your life. Let go even of who you think you must become. And that hurts, not because of external loss, but because you are leaving behind a familiar part of yourself. Maybe you once thought tests were meant to measure you, but maybe they are meant to reveal what is inside you, that you have never faced. Maybe God is showing you what you are holding onto too tightly. A relationship, a job, a self-image, a belief about how life should unfold. And when that is shaken, you feel like you are losing yourself. But maybe you are not losing. You are being separated from what no longer fits you. And that is not easy to accept, because you don't know what will come after you let go. You don't know who you will become if you stop holding on. And in that not knowing, you feel uneasy. But look a little deeper. There have been times when you knew what was right, not because someone told you, but because inside you, there was a quiet clarity. But you ignored it, not because you didn't understand, but because you didn't want to face it. You kept praying, kept searching, kept asking, as if the answer had never come. But maybe the answer has been there for a long time. You just weren't ready to accept it. Maybe God is not silent. Maybe He has already spoken, but what He said is not what you wanted to hear. And that is also a test. Are you willing to listen, even when the answer is uncomfortable? Are you willing to follow, even when the path doesn't match your plans? Are you willing to trust, even when you don't understand? There are times when you are too busy, not just with work, but with your own mind. You think too much, worry too much, analyze too much, and in all that noise, you expect to hear God. But how can you hear when there is no silence within you? Maybe the test is not asking you to do more. Maybe it is asking you to stop. To stop and see what you are running from. To stop and recognize what you are afraid of. To stop and listen, not with your ears, but with the stillness inside. And there is one more thing, deeper, more honest. Sometimes, you don't just fail to hear. You are afraid to hear. Afraid that if you truly listen, you will have to change. Afraid that if you truly open up, you will have to let something go. Afraid that if you truly face it, you won't be able to go back to who you were. So, you keep a distance. You still pray, but not too deeply. You still believe, but not fully. You still open your heart, but not completely. And then, you wonder why you don't hear anything. Maybe God is not silent. Maybe you are standing at a distance where you cannot hear clearly. But that doesn't mean you are wrong. It doesn't mean you are weak. It only means you are human. And humans are often afraid of what they cannot control. We want to understand before we trust. We want certainty before we step forward. We want clarity before we let go. But the way God leads is not always like that. And that is where the real test begins. Not in your circumstances, but in whether you are willing to step into something you cannot fully control. And maybe the hardest part is not overcoming the test, but accepting that this test is not here to make you stronger in the way you expected, but to make you more real. Real with your fears, real with your weakness, real with the parts of you you have been hiding. And in that honesty, something begins to change. Not suddenly, not loudly, but deeply. And maybe that is exactly what God is doing within you. Not to break you, but to separate you from what is no longer truly you. And then, after all that inner tension, if you slow down enough, if you become honest enough with yourself, you begin to notice something very different. Something quiet, not immediately clear, but deep enough to soften what has been tight within you. Maybe God has never left. Not just a comforting phrase, but something you begin to feel. Not through logic, not through explanations, but through a very subtle shift within you. You are still in the same situation. The difficulties may not have disappeared. The questions may still have no clear answers, but something inside you is no longer the same. You are no longer as panicked as before, no longer trying to force an answer at all costs, no longer being pulled away by every passing thought. You begin to have moments of stillness, very brief, but enough to breathe. And in those moments, you realize you are still standing. Not because everything is okay, but because you are no longer resisting everything the way you used to. Maybe that is the first change. Not that your circumstances are resolved, but that the way you are within them has begun to shift. You begin to understand there are things that don't need to be fixed immediately, don't need to be understood right away, don't need to be changed right away. Some things simply need to be stayed with long enough for you to see them more clearly. And in that staying, a very gentle kind of peace begins to emerge. Not a great joy, not complete relief, but a feeling that you no longer have to try so hard. You still move forward, but not in a rush. You still think, but you are no longer carried away by it. You still pray, but you no longer force yourself to hear something. And maybe, in that absence of forcing, you begin to hear. Not a clear voice, not a specific answer, but a very subtle guidance. A sense that you should pause here. A sense that you don't need to say more. A sense that, even without understanding, you can continue. These things are very small, but if you pay attention, you will see they are appearing more often. And you begin to realize, maybe, God does not speak the way you expected, but He is still guiding, still there, still working, in a very different way. Not through grand signs, but through very deep, very quiet movements within you. You begin to understand, the test is not about proving how strong you are, but about learning to trust when you have nothing left to hold on to. Not trusting the outcome, but trusting the journey. Not trusting that everything will go your way, but trusting that, however it unfolds, you are still being led. And that kind of faith is not loud, not dramatic, not something you need to prove. It is quiet, deep, and sometimes you only recognize it when you look back. You look back at the days you thought you couldn't survive, but you did. You look back at the times you felt completely lost, yet you are still here. Not perfect, not clear, but still moving forward. And you begin to understand, something has been holding you. Not your strength, not your plans, but something beyond what you can control. Maybe that is how God works. Not always by changing your circumstances, but by staying within you, so you do not collapse. Not always by changing the path, but by changing the way you walk it. And when you begin to see things this way, the test no longer feels the same. It is no longer just difficulty. It becomes a space where you are invited to let go a little. Let go of needing to understand. Let go of needing to control. Let go even of needing to become a perfect version of yourself. You begin to accept that you don't need to have all the answers. You don't need to know the entire path ahead. You don't need to be strong all the time. You can be weak. You can be tired. You can be uncertain. And that does not take you further away from God. In fact, maybe in that very weakness, you are closer to Him than ever before. Because you are no longer relying entirely on yourself. You begin to open to something greater. Not by forcing, but by allowing yourself not to know. Allowing yourself to slow down, allowing yourself to stay in the uncertainty without running away. And in that allowing, you begin to feel something very gentle. That you are not alone. Not because you see clearly, but because you begin to trust. Not a loud, overwhelming faith, but a quiet one, deep, still there, even when you feel nothing. And maybe that is what God is building within you. Not a life without difficulty, but a heart that can stand within difficulty. Not a path that is always clear, but a trust, even when the path becomes unclear. And when you begin to live with that trust, you realize God does not need to speak loudly for you to hear. He does not need to make things obvious for you to see. Because He has been there from the very beginning. It's just that now, you are finally slow enough, quiet enough to notice. Maybe, at this point, you no longer need another explanation. No longer need another reason to understand why things happen. No longer need a clear answer to know what to do next. Maybe what you truly need is just a moment to stop. Not stopping on the outside, but stopping within. Stopping the thoughts that keep running. Stopping the need to understand everything immediately. Stopping even the effort to get through this test as quickly as possible. Just staying with yourself, as you are right now. You don't need to become different right away. You don't need to be stronger. You don't need to be more positive. If you are tired, just admit that you are tired. If you are confused, let yourself be confused. If you are uncertain, allow yourself not to know. Because maybe, it is precisely in the moment you stop trying to hide, stop trying to control, that you truly begin to open. Try right now. If you can, just pause for a moment. You don't need to do anything special. You don't need to say much. Just take a slow breath, a deeper breath than usual. And in that moment, don't look for God somewhere far away. Don't try to hear something clear. Just notice whether you feel a little more at ease, a little lighter, a little less like you have to try so hard. Maybe that is where you begin. Not beginning with a plan. Not beginning with a big decision, but beginning with presence. You don't need to go further right now. You don't need to understand the whole journey. Just one very small step, returning to yourself. And if you are honest enough, slow enough, you will realize you were never truly alone. Maybe, before, you were looking for God in big things, in powerful moments, in clear signs. But maybe, it is time to look for Him in very small things. In a slow breath, in a quiet moment, in a gentle feeling that you are still being held, even when you have little strength left. You don't need to name it right away. You don't need to be certain that this is God. Just allow yourself to stay with it. And if it truly is His presence, you will come to recognize it. Not through reasoning, but through a peace so real, so deep, that you could never create it on your own. And maybe, the most important thing is not that you understand this test, but that you stop running from it, stop avoiding it, stop trying to fill every empty space with urgency. But instead, dare to stay right in that space. Because maybe, the very place you once feared the most is the place where God is waiting for you. Not to judge, not to blame, but simply to be there with you. You don't need to do anything to deserve that. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to reach a certain state. You only need to return. Even just a little. Even just for a moment. Even just a quiet thought. Maybe I'm not alone. And if you are still listening now, maybe you have already begun. Not loudly, not clearly, but truly. And maybe this journey is not about finding answers, but about becoming still enough to recognize what has always been there. So maybe the question is no longer, what is God testing you with? But, are you willing to stay and walk through this test in a new way? Not through force, not through proving something, but through the stillness. You are slowly learning again. And if there is one thing you can take with you after this, not an answer, but an invitation. A very gentle invitation. That whenever you feel tired, whenever you feel lost, whenever you don't know what to do, you can return. You don't have to go anywhere far. Just return to yourself. And there, maybe, you will begin to see, this test is not here to break you, but to lead you back, closer to yourself, and closer to God. Maybe, you still don't have all the answers, but you don't need them right now. Because maybe, what matters more, is that you no longer feel completely lost. And if you want, you can share something real in the comments below. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be long. Just honest. In your journey, has there been a moment when you felt this test was teaching you something you had never seen before? If this message touched you, you can gently share this video with someone you feel might be going through a difficult season too. Sometimes, you don't need to explain much. Just send it, and let them feel it in their own way. And if you want to continue this journey, not to find more answers, but to go deeper into stillness, you can stay and subscribe to the channel. Not to change everything overnight, but to slowly return to yourself and to God in a very real way. Before you leave, maybe we can take a brief moment to pray together. It doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be the right way. Just sincere. God, if what I'm going through is a test, give me enough calm not to be afraid. If I am trying to control too much, teach me how to let go. If I am lost, stay with me, even when I cannot see the way. Give me enough stillness to recognize you in the smallest things, and enough trust to keep going, even when I don't understand. Amen.